greatest tragedy of the American Civil War wasn't just the hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The real tragedy might have been if both sides had agreed to peace. A negotiated settlement sounds merciful, or would end the bloodletting, but the reality is it could create more unsettling than any battlefield. An uneasy truce that leaves slavery intact, inviting European powers to quietly leverage the South's cotton and, in time, consider diplomatic recognition. Picture this. Appomattox Courthouse, 1865. Lee's sword rests untouched. Grant's horse shifts in the dust outside. The war's end is not marked by a handshake, but by a silence that lingers, heavy and unresolved, as if history itself is holding its breath. The scene inside the McLaren farmhouse is tense, the air pressed flat by the weight of everything unspoken. This is not the dignified closure that history books sometimes paint. Instead, it's a room where two men, Lee and Grant, face each other not as symbols of a nation reuniting, but as representatives of two causes, both battered and weary. Historically, the two generals meet here, face to face, to negotiate the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But imagine instead if Lincoln's cabinet in Washington and Davis's provisional government in Richmond had struck a formal truce, one crafted far from the battlefield, its language shaped by political necessity, rather than the immediate reality of war. In this alternate moment, Lee and Grant aren't discussing the practicalities of surrender. They're reviewing the articles of a ceasefire sent from their distant capitals, neither man having the authority to alter a single clause. There is no handshake. There's only a stiff exchange, a nod that feels more like a formality than a gesture of respect. The truce is inked under pressure, a document born of exhaustion and political calculation. For the North, it's a bitter admission. 4 years of bloodshed have failed to restore the Union. For the South, it's a fragile claim to nationalhood, a confederacy recognized only by its own battered signature. The silence that follows isn't relief. It's the uneasy quiet of a country split in two, a vacuum where something vital was meant to be. Outside, the armies simply stop. Soldiers who, just hours before, were locked in combat now stand in uncertain lines, staring across a new and invisible border. Their rifles, Springfields and Ironfields, lower in unison. Not in surrender, but in suspension. One man from Ohio, grim, still streaked across his face, glances at a boy from Georgia. They don't speak, they don't wave, they just stand. Futures suddenly untethered, as if waiting for someone to tell them what comes next. In a single moment, they are no longer countrymen, they are not victors or vanquished, just two kinds of strangers, paused on the edge of a new reality. The historical record tells us that Grant, on April 9, 1865, offered generous terms. Officers could keep their sidearms, mend their horses for spring planting, a gesture meant to foster dignity and healing. Here, though, the generosity is replaced by the hard lines of political settlement. The terms are precise, cold, borders drawn, prisoners exchanged according to international precedent, reparations calculated and itemized. Gone is a sense of reconciliation. In this place, a treaty that reads like cold commerce, clauses on territory and tariffs, while the majority of Americans grapple with a deeper, unspoken rapture. The aftermath unfolds in slow motion. The camps, once alive with the noise of war, fall eerily quiet. Soldiers pack their belongings, their movements mechanical. The questions hang in the air. Where is the new border? Will my home be on the right side? The journey home is surreal, a procession of men in blue and gray walking side by side along roads that now cross from one country into another. For a few miles, they share water, maybe a word or two, but an invisible wall stands between them. At a crossroads, the Pennsylvanians turn north, the Virginians south. No farewells are spoken. They simply part, their paths splitting into separate, uncertain futures. Nothing about this feels like peace. It's as if the war has been paused, not ended. The rituals of surrender are hollowed out. Stacked arms are not a sign of closure, but a temporary measure. Parole slips aren't ticketed home to a unified nation. They're travel documents stamped with the seal of a foreign power. Grant's famous uniform, described in newspapers as muddy and unadorned, is just another detail lost in the paperwork. The handshake that history records as a symbol of reunion never happens. Its absence is a wound that refuses to close, a missing gesture that leaves both sides unmoored. Without that handshake, there is no catharsis, no moment of grace, only the relentless logic of a settlement that satisfies no one and honors nothing. The war's central question, whether the Union would endure, receives no answer, just a bureaucratic pause. The moral question of slavery, so central to the conflict, is left unresolved. The North, having abolished slavery within its new borders, can only watch as the South preserves it, enshrined now in law and custom. The silence at Appomattox is the sound of that question echoing into the future, a challenge deferred to generations yet unborn. The scene fades from the farmhouse parlor, but instead of a single memory there are now two. Lee mounts Traveler and rides away, not as a defeated general, but as the senior officer of a new and wary nation. Grant stands in the doorway, the burden of a fractured Union settling on his shoulders. They leave in opposite directions, the space between them growing wider with every step. What follows is a landscape changed not by the thunder of cannons, but by the quiet construction of division. The soldiers disperse, their uniforms blending into the countryside, but the lines drawn by politicians remain. The new border isn't just a line on a map, it's a fracture running through families, farms, and the very idea of what it means to be American. The truce has ended the fighting, but it has also begun something else. A slow, uneasy process of separation, where every road, every river, and every handshake, or lack thereof, becomes a reminder of what was lost. The question now isn't just who won or who lost, but how a nation can be divided and still claim to share a history. The answer lies not in the farmhouse at Appomattox, but in the lines that will soon be drawn across the continent. Lines that cut deeper than any wound from the war itself. In this alternate timeline, the familiar map of the United States becomes a study in uncertainty. The lines that once marked state boundaries now harden in an international frontier, one that slices through old loyalties and redraws the meaning of home. The new border isn't a single, clean cut. It's a patchwork shaped by rivers, where possible, by arbitrary latitude, where it's not. The Potomac and the Ohio become more than just waterways. They're the spine of a new divide. In the east, the question of Virginia's western counties is reopened. West Virginia, which split from its parent in 1863 to join the Union, now finds its fate tangled in negotiations. Some counties might remain with the USA, while others might be claimed by the Confederacy. Each decision a fresh source of tension. The border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, are carved up by compromise, geography, and the shifting fortunes of war, leaving families and towns caught in the middle. The first days after the treaty are chaos for those who live along the line. A farm that once sat comfortably in the heart of the country now straddles two nations. A father's fields are in the Confederacy, his daughter's school in the Union. Daily life becomes a negotiation. Which flag flies over the courthouse? Which currency pays the taxes? The legal confusion is immediate and relentless. Some towns wake up to find themselves under a new government. Their postmasters replaced, their newspapers suddenly suspect. The border is a wound that never heals. Treaties hurriedly drafted attempted to impose order. Joint commissions are formed to place custom posts at key crossings, a practice seen in other 19th century boundary settlements, now awkwardly adapted to the American heartland. Along the Ohio and Potomac, small wooden shacks rise where there were once only ferry docks and dusty roads. U.S. Marshals and Confederate Rangers eye each other across narrow rivers, their uniforms crisp or worn, their faces familiar but now marked by suspicion. The new rules are confusing, not just for those tasked with enforcing them, but for everyone whose life crosses the border. Every journey to market, every visit to a relative becomes an exercise in paperwork and patience. The border's impact isn't just bureaucratic, it's personal. St. Louis, a city rooted in Union loyalty but tethered to Southern commerce, finds itself cut off from the Mississippi's southern flow. Goods pile up at docks awaiting inspection or bribes. Kentucky's neutrality crumbles. Its southern counties bristle with new fortifications. Its northern towns fill with refugees and opportunists. Smugglers thrive in the new gray zones, ferrying contraband cotton north and manufactured goods south. The riverbanks are alive with whispers of deals struck, of news traded, of people slipping quietly from one world to the other. And then there's the matter of news itself. The delay in communication becomes a source of chaos and opportunity. In our world, the news of emancipation reached Texas so late that June 19, 1865, Juneteenth, became a day of liberation long after the fact. In this divided America, the lag is weaponized. Newspapers on the Confederate side print stories that paint the Union as a failed experiment. Northern broadsheets warn of Southern tyranny and the dangers lurking just across the river. Sometimes the same event is reported two ways, or not even at all. In the confusion, rumors become currency. A family in Maryland hears that their kin in Virginia have been conscripted by the new government, but no letter arrives to confirm it. A merchant in Missouri learns that tariffs have changed only after his goods are seized at the border. For those who try to cross, the stakes are higher still. The border is porous, but dangerous. Enslaved men and women see the line as a path to freedom, but the journey is now a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Every successful escape sparks a round of accusations, letters between Washington and Richmond, threats of reprisals, and the constant fear that one misstep could reignite open conflict. The old Underground Railroad routes become even more perilous. Every safe house now a potential flashpoint. The landscape itself changes. Along the border towns are reshaped by the demands of security and suspicion. New roads are built to skirt custom posts. Old ones fall into despair. School curricula split along national lines. In the North, children learn of a war fought to preserve the Union, a tragic defeat that must never be repeated. And in the South, the story is one of triumph, a second revolution, a birth of a new nation. Holidays diverge. The 4th of July in the Union is a somber affair tinged with loss. In the Confederacy, a new day of independence is celebrated, the date of the peace treaty marked with parades and speeches. The very idea of what it means to be American fractures into two, each side defining itself in opposition to the other. Commerce becomes a daily test of the new reality. Picture a market town on the Ohio River. One on the northern bank, U.S. dollars change hands, and federal marshals patrol the streets. The news from Cincinnati is filled with warnings about Confederate plots. Cross the river by ferry and everything shifts. Confederate dollars bearing Jefferson Davis's likeness. Buy flour and cloth. The men in gray uniforms talk about rebuilding, about providing their place in the world. The local paper praises the Southern cause and rails against the decadence of the North. The same goods cost different amounts, taxed under different regimes. Even the air feels charged. The distance between the two banks far greater than the width of the river. The new border shapes not just trade, but identity. The shared past becomes a battleground. In the North, the Civil War is remembered as a bitter failure to preserve the Union, a warning against division. In the South, its founding myth, a story of resistance and self-determination. The word American no longer means the same thing on both sides of the line. Are you a U.S. American or a Confederate American? The distinction becomes a marker of loyalty, a question that lingers in every conversation and every introduction. For some, the division is a daily frustration. For others, it is a quiet source of pride or resentment. The handshake that never happened at Appomattox leaves a vacuum filled instead by the routines of border checks, the rituals of new holidays, the slow grinding work of building parallel societies. The continent is split not just by politics, but by the slow accumulation of difference. Laws, customs, even the way people talk about the past. Yet beneath the surface, the border remains tender. Any crisis, a trade dispute, a skirmish at customs post, a political assassination could tear open the fragile peace. The wound never fully closes. The two nations watch each other, wary and unresolved, each wondering if the next spark will be the one that reignites the fire. And as the years pass, the division seeps into every layer of life. Some try to bridge the gap, merchants, families, or old friends, but the current always pulls them back to their own side. The camera pulls back, the line on the map now stark and undeniable. Two countries side by side, each carrying the memory of what was lost. And in the silence that follows, a different kind of question takes root. One that echoes in the halls of power, in schoolrooms, and in the quiet moments of ordinary people. What becomes of those who try to hold the nation together? And how will their stories be told in this new divided world? In the shadow of division, Lincoln's name moves quietly through the new American landscape. It doesn't ring out in triumph. Instead, it drifts, half legend, half warning, between the walls of classrooms and the low-lit corners of taverns. The Lincoln Memorial, if it rises at all, is not the grand marble temple that commands the mall in our world. Here, it stands smaller, somber, set back from the Potomac's edge. The stone is darker, the steps less worn. Where our world's monument proclaims unity and hope, this one bears a plaque that reads only, "In memory of the Union lost." A faded inscription below whispers of fallen hope. Visitors come, but they do not gather in awe. They linger in quiet, reflective clusters, eyes fixed on a marble figure whose gaze seems to pass through the Capitol, searching for something that isn't coming back. The commemorations themselves feel different in this timeline. When Lincoln's body is carried home, the processions are heavy with a sense of unfinished business. His coffin travels by train through northern cities, each stop a public mourning, but the crowds are subdued, the grief, complicated. In Chicago, a boy stands on a curb, hat pressed to his chest, while his father mutters about the peace that broke the country. Across the border, Confederate flags fly at half-mast for their own dead, not for Lincoln. The sight of Union bands playing dirges is met by the distant echo of Southern celebrations, or by silence. Two nations, side by side, mark the same movement with different rituals, a split screen of memory. The legend of Lincoln becomes tangled in this divided mourning. His story reshaped by the absence of a single unifying victory. It's likely Lincoln would still have faced Booth's bullet. His enemies were real and the bitterness ran deep. But in this world, his assassination does not sanctify a cause. The shot at Ford's Theater is not the birth of a martyr, but the tragic end of a presidency that failed to hold the center. The news spreads through the North, not as a rallying cry, but as a final devastating punctuation mark. In the South, the reaction is colder. Some see it as a grim justice, the end of a tyrant who tried to subdue them. In the capitals of Europe, diplomats mark his death with polite regret, noting the passing of a leader whose vision could not survive the realities of war and politics. His words preserved in pamphlets and newspapers take on a different tone. The Gettysburg Address, soaring spare and immortal in our timeline, lands with a heavier irony. A new birth of freedom rings hollow when across the river a nation built on slavery stands unbroken. The promise that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, becomes a reminder of what was lost, not what was secured. His speeches are no longer the foundational stones of a renewed republic. They become instead the elegies of a broken ideal, read in classrooms, recited at memorials, but always with the knowledge that the world he dreamed of never came to be. In the North, Lincoln's legacy is complicated. He is mourned as Lincoln the Tragic, a man of vision and courage, but ultimately a leader who watched his country slip through his fingers. His face appears on currency, but the $5 bill is a quiet reminder of loss, not unity. The penny bears his profile, but it feels like a token from a different era, a daily echo of what the country used to be. Schoolchildren learn about his presidency as an ill-fated struggle, a desperate attempt to preserve the Union that ended in compromise and separation. Teachers describe the impossible choices he faced: endless war or divided peace, principle or survival. He is remembered for the burden he carried, not for the victory he could not deliver. In the South, now Lincoln is cast as the defeated adversary. He is the man who tried and failed to force the Confederacy back into the Union. His name is spoken with a mixture of relief and resentment. Some see his end as the final act of their own independence, a villain's downfall. In Richmond, his portrait is absent from public spaces, his words rarely quoted except as examples of northern arrogance. The textbooks here tell a different story. Lincoln as the architect of destruction, the outsider whose ambitions collapse against the will of the Southern people. On the world stage, well, this judgment is clinical. European observers see Lincoln as a well-meaning but unsuccessful statesman, a leader whose ideals could not overcome the realities of his divided country. In London and Paris, his death is noted but not mourned. The American experiment, once a beacon, now stands as a cautionary tale, a republic fractured by its own contradictions. Its leader remembered not for triumph, but for the limits of his power. Then there is the Emancipation Proclamation. In our timeline, it was a turning point, a document that transformed the war from a fight for union into a fight for freedom. But even then, its power depended on the advance of Union armies. It freed enslaved people only in the rebelling states as territory was captured, not across the entire United States. In this alternate history, its impact is even more limited. The proclamation becomes a symbol of unfulfilled promise, a document that proclaims freedom while slavery remains legal just across a new border. Its words are studied in northern schools as a testament to high ideals, but also as a reminder of the boundaries of law and the compromises of politics. In the South, it is dismissed as an irrelevant threat, the act of a foreign president with no power over their land. The Lincoln Memorial, with its dark stone and subdued inscription, becomes a gathering place for those who remember what might have been. On certain anniversaries, small crowds assemble, laying wreaths beneath the statue. The air is heavy with a sense of absence. The capital city itself feels changed, no longer the heart of a continent-spanning republic, but a border town, its monuments looking inward. The silence here is not peace, but the echo of a dream deferred. Lincoln's legacy moves through this divided country as a whisper. In the North, it is a story of noble failure. In the South, a warning against overreach. In the wider world, a lesson in the fragility of ideals. His words linger not as rallying cries, but as questions unanswered, unresolved. And just beyond the city, the river marks the line where two worlds begin to watch each other. The capitals on either side of that border grow weary, their monuments casting long shadows across the water. The silence at Lincoln's Memorial is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new kind of tension, one that waits quietly, watching for what comes next. Just over 110 miles of rolling hills and muddy roads separate Washington, D.C. from Richmond, Virginia. On a map, it's a short stretch, an afternoon's journey by train, a hard day's ride on horseback. But in this divided America, the two capitals stand closer than comfort allows. Each city locked in each other's gaze across a border that never lets anyone forget what's at stake. Geography makes them neighbors, history makes them rivals. Washington, D.C. sits on the edge of uncertainty. Its grand avenues, planned by Elefant to reality, confidence now doubles as a defensive corridor. The White House, the Capitol Dome, the marble columns, they all stand watchful. Less like monuments to a thriving republic and more like sentinels at the edge of a fault line. Every government building is built with an eye towards security. The city's mood is cautious, its ceremonies tinged with anxiety. The Potomac River, once a gentle boundary, now marks the edge of a nation's nerve. Border checkpoints rise at the water's edge, each one a reminder that the city's fate is tied to the actions of its closest adversary. From the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the southern bank is no longer a symbol of unity, it's the first glimpse of foreign soil. Richmond, by contrast, is a city reborn. The war's scars have been covered by new facades and fresh ambition. Where Washington's architecture clings to classical restraint, Richmond's public buildings reach for grandeur. The Confederate Capitol is expanded, columns multiplied, its great halls echoing with the confidence of a newly recognized nation. The design isn't just for show, it's a deliberate signal, a way to legitimize the Confederate experiment in the eyes of the world. This is how new states announce themselves: marble, granite, and the scale of their own ambition. The cities across the host balls and candlelit halls, the air thick with talk of cotton prices and European trade. Richmond's power is performative, but it's real. The city's leaders want the world to see performance, not just survival. The two capitals develop in parallel, each a mirror and a provocation to the other. Washington's formal receptions are tense, every conversation a negotiation, every gesture weighted for meaning. The U.S. Secretary of State shakes hands with the Confederate ambassador, but the smiles are thin. Across the river, Richmond's gatherings are louder, more assured. The city celebrates its independence with parades and state dinners, confident in its place on the world stage. The contrast is visible in every detail: the measured restraint of the Washington ceremonies, the over-display of Richmond's pageantry. Much of the tension seeps into the physical landscape. The Potomac is no longer just a river, but a fortified boundary. Small customs houses or armed guards watch the crossings. U.S. patrol boats idle in their current. Their presence is a daily reminder that peace is conditional. Bridges become checkpoints. Lines of travelers waiting for papers to be stamped, cargo to be inspected. On both sides, rumors swirl about spies, about defectors, about the next provocation that could tip the balance. For Washington's residents, the southern horizon is a source of constant unease. Richmond's for the northern skyline is a challenge, a reminder that old enemies are never far away. Espionage becomes routine. Each embassy is a nest of informants, each diplomat mission a theater of suspicion. The Confederate embassy in Washington sits just blocks from the White House, its windows shuttered, its staff under surveillance. In Richmond, the U.S. delegation operates in a climate of polite hostility. Every piece of news, every public announcement is dissected for hidden meanings. A new tariff in the north, a trade deal in the south. Each move is a signal, a test of resolve. The capitals are locked in a silent contest, every decision scrutinized, every rumor amplified. This rivalry shapes the very fabric of daily life. Washington's government invests in industry, infrastructure, and intelligence, determined to prove the Union's resilience. Richmond, flush with cotton profits and eager for recognition, pours resources into grand public works and military parades. The city's elite walk with the confidence of victors, their fortunes tied to the global demand for southern exports. The economic models diverge. One city leans into industrial might, the other into the wealth of plantations and the labor of the enslaved. The split deepens with every year. The proximity of the two capitals, just over 100 miles, but worlds apart, keeps the wound open. Every morning, Washington wakes to the knowledge that its greatest rival is almost within sight. Every morning, Richmond's leaders toast their independence, knowing how close the enemy remains. The Potomac's slow current carries more than water, It carries a weight of unresolved history, the memory of a nation that split but never settled its debts. In this alternate timeline, the Cold War isn't fought across oceans, it's fought along roads that run from Washington to Richmond, in the halls of government, in the markets and the back rooms of border towns. Proxy conflicts flare in the West, in Mexico, in the Caribbean. As each capital seeks to expand its influence without risking open war, the rivalry is intimate, relentless, and inescapable. The cities themselves become symbols. Washington, with its classical facades and careful ceremonies, stands for a union that remembers what is lost. While Richmond, with its new monuments and political squares, proclaims a future built on its own terms. The difference is visible in stone and steel, in the way people walk the streets, in the music that drifts from open windows at night. Across the Potomac, the lights of the other capital are always visible on the horizon. For those who live in the shadow of the border, the division is not theoretical, it's daily reality. Children grow up learning two visions of history. Merchants calculate prices in two currencies. Diplomats wake each day to the possibility that today's slight could become tomorrow's crisis. And while the capitals maneuver and posture, the true consequences of division ripple outward. The border is not just a line on a map, but a living, shifting presence. It shapes every decision, every relationship, every hope for what the continent might still become. The story of these two cities is just not about power, it's about spaces in between, the places where the border is felt most sharply, where every crossing is a risk and every silence is loaded. And as the capitals harden, the lines on the ground grow, more sensitive, ready to flare at the slightest touch. The Mason-Dixon line, once a surveyor's answer to colonial confusion, becomes something else entirely. In this fractured America, it's no longer a line on a map, it's a living nerve stretched thin across the heart of the continent. The war between armies may be over, but here, in the hush of the borderlands, another battle begins. It's fought in the shadows, in the rustle of leaves on the midnight crossing, in the quick glance over a shoulder as a lantern flickers in the distant window. The peace that ended open conflict has not brought the true quiet. Instead, it has transformed the border into a place where every footstep, every whisper could spark a crisis. Picture a cold night along the Ohio River. The moon hides behind clouds, and the only sounds are the water's slow current and the faint crunch of dead leaves. Someone moves carefully through the trees, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the opposite bank. For them, the river's more than a geographical boundary. It's the line between bondage and a chance at something like freedom. In this new world, that chance is never guaranteed. Every crossing is an act of defiance, every safe house a risk. What was once an underground network could have evolved into an international smuggling operation, challenging the treaty's fugitive slave clause. Before the war, the Underground Railroad was a network of citizens breaking their own country's laws. Now, it becomes an operation that tests the limits of international diplomacy. The old Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, already a source of national agony, would have been reborn as a clause embedded in the peace treaty itself, ratified in the 10 months after Andrew Johnson's proclamations declared the rebellion over in 1866. The Confederacy would see this clause as non-negotiable. The right to reclaim enslaved people who cross the border. The United States, bound by treaty but pulled by conscience, faces a crisis that refuses to fade. Three groups become the new actors in this quiet war. Confederate bounty hunters, now carrying the full authority of their government, move along the border with practiced skill. They know the trails, the river crossings, the places where the brush is just thick enough to hide a desperate family. For them, every successful capture is both a payday and a patriotic act. On the other side, abolitionist agents work in secret. They are no longer just idealists, they are now part of a covert resistance, experts in false papers, coded signals, and hidden compartments. Their safe houses become foreign embassies of hope. Between these two northern marshals, operate in a space that is neither clear nor safe. They are charged with upholding the law, which now means cooperating with the Confederacy's demands. But the law itself is at odds with the values of the people they serve. Confederate bounty hunters and Northern marshals would clash in border towns, turning every tavern into a stage of clandestine diplomacy and moral crisis. The tension is constant, the atmosphere thick with suspicion. For every marshal who quietly looks the other way, there is another who feels the pressure of federal duty. For every bounty hunter who crosses the river, there is an abolitionist agent ready to risk everything to send a coded warning. The law is shifting things, sometimes enforced, sometimes ignored, always contested. The United States, especially in the North, face a paradox it cannot escape. The abolitionist movement, which grew louder and more organized as the war dragged on, refuses to accept the compromise of the peace. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, these cities become sanctuaries in spirit, if not always in law. Newspapers print stories of families torn apart, of children snatched back across the border, of communities rallying to protect their neighbors. State legislators pass laws to obstruct or nullify the Fugitive Slave Clause, daring the federal government to intervene. The crisis is not just between nations, it's within the Union itself, as local and state governments rebel against the demands of an uneasy peace. Diplomatic notes fly between Richmond and Washington. The Confederacy accuses the United States of harboring criminals, of violating the treaty, of undermining the very foundation of their relationship. The United States replies with legal arguments and moral outrage, but every escape, every act of defiance becomes another wedge driven between the two governments. The issue never fades. It festers, poisoning every attempt at normal diplomacy, every negotiation over trade or territory. On the ground, the conflict is personal. A Quaker farmer in southern Ohio hides a family in his barn. The fear in his eyes matched only by his resolve. He knows that if he's caught, the consequences will be severe. Imprisonment, ruin, the loss of everything he's built. Yet he acts because the alternative is unthinkable. Down the road, a Confederate patrol moves quietly, searching for signs of passage. They have the right under the treaty to pursue fugitives a set distance into U.S. territory. Their presence is a daily reminder that the border is not a wall, but a membrane, porous, dangerous, alive with threat. The border towns become places where the rules change with every shift in the wind. Some residents become informants, trading secrets for money or protection. Others join the resistance, risking everything for a cause that feels larger than themselves. The line between hero and criminal blurs with every new law, every new demand from the capitals. The landscape itself absorbs the tension. Roads are watched and ferries are inspected, and the riverbanks are dotted with the remnants of the failed escapes. This is not a peace that heals. It is a peace that festers, a daily struggle where the core question of the war: can a nation be built on freedom coexist with a nation built on slavery? This remains unanswered. The Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River become more than just boundaries. They are scars, visible reminders that the conflict never truly ended. Every successful crossing is a diplomatic incident. Every capture is a headline. The two nations remain locked in suspicion, unable to move forward, unable to let go of the past. The longer this quiet war drags on, the deeper the mistrust grows. Trade talks stall, joint projects collapse under the weight of mutual suspicion. Even the simplest negotiations, maybe a new ferry route, a postal agreement, are colored by the knowledge that just out of sight, another escape is being planned, another confrontation brewing. The border is a place of hushed warnings and silent prayers, a landscape where hope and fear live side by side. Night after night, the pattern repeats: the river, the woods, the hurried footsteps, a lantern in an upstairs window shining out into the dark. It's a small act, but it means everything. A signal, a promise, a refusal to accept the world as it is. The border does not just divide two nations, it divides two visions of what America could be. And while the line holds, the future waits, shaped not by the treaties and armies, but by those who risk everything in the quiet hours, believing that the story isn't finished yet. The West was never just empty land waiting for a flag. It was a prize, a providing ground. And in this divided America, it becomes a stage for a cold mythological contest. Manifest destiny fractures. Two nations, each convinced of their own right to the horizon, move west, not as a single tide, but as a rival currents, each determined to shape the land in their own image. Picture the Great Plains, grass stretching to the sky, broken only by the distant silhouettes of surveyor teams and railroad crews. In this alternate timeline, southern rail lines could have extended steadily toward the Pacific, driven by Confederate policy and ambition. Each mile a track is a statement. The Confederacy intends to be more than a regional power. These lines don't just move cotton and tobacco, they carry a vision of the South that stretches from the Mississippi to the furthest reaches of California. Every new depot is a marker, a challenge to the United States, a promise that the contest for the West is only beginning. For the United States, the push west is no longer about fulfilling a singular destiny. It's about holding ground, securing what remains, and providing that the Union still matters. Homesteaders, miners, and small town merchants become the new front line. Their towns, hastily built, fiercely independent, dot the landscape in a patchwork of hope and anxiety. The U.S. Army builds new forts, not just to protect settlers, but to signal to the Confederacy that the West is not theirs for the taking. Confederate ambitions, meanwhile, expand with a deliberate logic. The Indian Territory, what might have become the state of Sequoia, stands in the crosshairs. The Confederacy eyes this land not just for its resources, but for the chance to cement its way of life deeper into the continent. Plantation owners dream of new fields, new fortunes, and new states carved from the prairies. The idea of purchasing Cuba from Spain simmers in Richmond, an echo of past schemes and a sign that the South's appetite for expansion is not limited to the mainland. The Caribbean, too. It becomes a chessboard. Every sugar field and port a potential asset in the Confederacy's quest for legitimacy and power. Not every ambition is realized. While the notion of annexing Mexican states like Chihuahua and Sonora floats through some circles, it remains more fantasy than policy. The Confederate focus for now remains on territories closer to home. Indian Territory, New Mexico, Arizona, places where the plantation economy can take root and the Southern model can be replicated. The dream is clear, a contiguous slave-holding empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific with all the resources and prestige that would entail. The West becomes a land of parallel societies. Imagine two frontier towns, sometimes only a day's ride apart, each a microcosm of the nation's ideals. On the U.S. side, towns grow from homestead claims, plots of lands worked by families, governed by rough assemblies, their economies built on free labor and the promise of ownership. The law is communal. The risks are shared, and every barn raises a vote of confidence in the idea of a freer West. But across the border, the Confederate vision takes shape. Here, the town center is often a manor house surrounded by fields, worked not by independent farmers, but by enslaved laborers or hired hands bound to the plantation hierarchy. The economy is consolidated. The law is the landowner's word, and the rhythms of daily life echo the Old South. The Confederate push into New Mexico and Arizona brings it not just new crops, but new social orders, plantation-driven cattle herds, large-scale cotton operations, and the deliberate effort to transplant the Southern way of life into unfamiliar soil. The most iconic figure of the West, that's the cowboy, splinters under this pressure. In Union territory, the wrangler is a free laborer, sometimes a Civil War veteran working cattle drives or staking his own claim. He owns his saddle, negotiates his wages, and moves with the restless optimism of someone who believes the land can be made his. In Confederate territory, the cattle herds are often managed by crews beholden to a single owner. Some are poor whites, some are Mexican, and some are black men, free or enslaved, whose labor is claimed by the plantation system. The skills are the same: riding, roping, surviving the loneliness of the range, but the meaning of their work is not. The cowboy is no longer a symbol of one nation's independence. He is a living contrast between two competing futures. Native nations, caught in the crossfire, are forced into a deadly diplomacy, playing two rival powers against each other for the chance to preserve what little land and autonomy remained. Treaties become a bargaining chip, alliances shift with every new railroad or fort, and the promise of a protection is always conditional, always temporary. The pressure is relentless, and the cost is measured in lost homelands and broken promises. This is not the gold rush chaos of our history. It is a slow, grinding escalation. Every new settlement, every telegraph line, every ranch is a move in a drawn-out game. Tensions simmer, and water rights disputes and skirmishes over grazing land, and the quiet threat of a flag planted where it wasn't the day before. The West becomes a front line not of armies, but of settlers and surveyors, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. Conflict is never far away. A border raid, a disputed claim, a single shot fired in the wrong canyon could trigger a crisis that pulls back nations back into the open war. The peace that holds in the East is always at risk in the West, where the rules are looser and the stakes feel existential. The threat of escalation hangs on every negotiation, every handshake, every promise made in a dusty saloon or a government office. Over time, the map of the West transforms. Instead of a patchwork of states unified by a common purpose, it becomes a mosaic of rival claims and uneasy truces. Free territories press against slave states, and every line drawn is another source of friction. The dream of manifest destiny, one people, one nation, one continent, fades into a contest of wills. The frontier, once a symbol of boundlessness, opportunity, becomes a source of constant anxiety, a place where the future is always uncertain and the past is never truly settled. From above, the land tells its own story. The lights of Union towns cluster along one set of railroad tracks, while the glow of Confederate settlements spreads from the south and the east. Two visions, two colors, bleeding into the same dark canvas. The West is no longer a promise, it's a question, one that neither side can answer alone. Yet for all the maneuvering, the fate of the continent will not be decided by rails or ranches alone. The West is only one front in a larger struggle, as both nations look outward, searching for allies and legitimacy. The contest for recognition and the judgment of the old powers waits just beyond the horizon. Recognition is currency. For the Confederacy, it's the difference between being a rogue experiment and a permanent nation. In the years after the truce, while diplomats in Richmond draft letters and send envoys across the Atlantic, the real battle moves from battlefields to drawing rooms. European capitals become the new theater. London's clubs, Paris's salons, and corridors of Whitehall and the Croix d'Or. It's here, beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the hush of velvet curtains, that the fate of a continent is decided. Confederate agents, once dismissed as rebels, now arrive in formal attire with carefully worded credentials. Their southern accents are no longer a curiosity, they're a sign of a new reality. The war is over, the map has changed, and the world's oldest empires must decide whether to acknowledge it. During the conflict, Britain and France kept their distance, wary of the moral cost. But as the years pass and the division hardens, diplomatic realism begins to outweigh abolitionist rage. The world has seen this before. Countries that hold their noses and shake hands because the alternative is uncertainty. Well, the calculation in London and Paris is pragmatic. Southern cotton still fuels the mills of Manchester and Lyon. The Confederacy's economy, battered but still rich in raw materials, offers a tempting promise. A divided America means two weaker states, neither able to dominate the hemisphere, both open to influence. For the British, who remember the sting of lost colonies, this is a chance to reset the balance. For the French, it's an opportunity to expand their reach in the Caribbean and Mexico. The question of slavery remains a public embarrassment, but in the private language of diplomacy, profit and power speak louder. Recognition comes not in the heat of war, but in the cold aftermath, when the dust has settled and the world is ready to accept the new status quo. With that nod from the old world, the Confederacy transforms overnight. European banks, once cautious, now compete to offer loans. British and French investors pour money into southern ports and railroads, eager to rebuild the infrastructure shattered by the war. The ports of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans become gateways for a flood of manufactured goods and machinery. The Confederate government, suddenly flush with credit, expands its army to rival its old foe, purchasing modern rifles, artillery, and warships. The blockade that once strangled the South dissolves into open trade. The CSA, once isolated, now stands on equal footing with its northern neighbor, at least in the eyes of the world. For the United States, the shock is profound. The same European powers that once watched the American experiment with fascination now treat it as just one player among many. The Monroe Doctrine, long the cornerstone of American foreign policy, is quietly set aside. British warships dock in Confederate harbors. French diplomats toast the new order in Richmond. In Washington, the mood shifts from defiance to anxiety. Every decision whether to build a new railroad, negotiate a treaty, or respond to a border dispute must account for the opinions of London and Paris. The sense of isolation is palpable. The United States, once the self-appointed guardian of the hemisphere, now finds itself flanked by rivals, its influence diluted. The psychological toll is heavy. In the halls of Congress, old dreams of manifest destiny give way to a defense posture. The rhetoric of unity is replaced by talk of survival and sovereignty. The optimism that powered westward expansion is replaced by a worry realism. The sense of American exceptionalism, so central to national identity, begins to erode. The country that once saw itself as a beacon now feels boxed in, forced to negotiate a world where its word no longer carries absolute weight. Meanwhile, Confederate ambitions stretch beyond their borders. Richmond might have sought to buy Cuba from Spain, echoing mid-19th century efforts to strengthen its sugar economy. The Caribbean becomes a chessboard with the Confederacy eager to plant its flag among the islands. The possibility of new treaties, new acquisitions, and new alliances shape every decision. The world watches as a slave-holding nation, once on the brink of collapse, sits at the table of nations, its legitimacy secured by ideals, but by the old world's willingness to do business. The consequences ripple far, far beyond the North America. The formal acceptance of the Confederacy by Britain and France prolongs the global legitimacy of slavery, undermining the momentum of abolitionist movements across Europe and the Americas. Campaigners for emancipation in London, Paris, and beyond find their cause weakened, their arguments undercut by the reality that profit has trumped principle. This message is clear. As long as an institution is profitable and recognized, its moral cost can be ignored. The new order reshapes alliances. The United States, spurned by its former partners, looks elsewhere for friends across the Atlantic. The newly unified German Empire emerges as a natural ally. Both nations share a common frustration with British and French dominance. Industrial cooperation follows as American know-how meets German ambition. What starts as a marriage of convenience deepens into strategic partnership, one that unsettles the balance of power in Europe and North America alike. The Confederacy, for its part, becomes a pillar of the British and French sphere. Trade agreements multiply. Joint military exercises take place along the Gulf and the Caribbean. Southern officers study in Paris and London. British engineers advise on Confederate railroads and shipyards. The South's economy, once only tied to cotton, diversifies under European guidance. The CSA's leaders, eager to prove their modernity, invest in industry and infrastructure, hoping to match the North's output and secure their place among the world's powers. But beneath the surface, the cost of legitimacy lingers. The Confederacy's foundation, its commitment to slavery, remains unchanged. The world's recognition does not erase the moral stain, instead it spreads it, weaving it into the fabric of global commerce and diplomacy. The world accepts, but the tension never really disappears. Protests flare in London and Paris. Abolitionists refuse to let the issue die, and the debate shifts from the halls of government to the streets, from polite conversation to politic outcry. Yet as long as the CSA's flag flies over its embassy, the reality stands. Slavery, for now, is not an aberration, but a fact of international life. As embassies open, treaties are signed and new maps are drawn, the division of the continent becomes permanent. The hope for reconciliation fades, replaced by the routines of rivalry. The United States and the Confederacy settle into their roles: neighbors, competitors, and increasingly proxies for the ambitions of powers far from their shores. The world's gaze turns elsewhere. Europe's own tensions simmer. Alliances shift, and the old powers look for new ways to tip the balance in their favor. In North America, the border grows colder, the stakes higher, and the sense of unfinished business settles over both nations. History does not pause. The next storm is already gathering far across the Atlantic, but its thunder will reach the divided shores of America soon enough. By the early 20th century, the United States and the Confederate States have spent generations glaring at each other across a fortified border. The world's biggest war doesn't just arrive on their doorstep, it finds them already half-ready, already suspicious, already armed. The Great War, as it unfolds in this alternate timeline, isn't just a European firestorm, it's a match tossed into a room soaked in old grievances and fresh ambition. The familiar black and white images of 1914 German troops on the march, British soldiers in the trenches, are only half of the story. Shift the map, and the lines of conflict redraw themselves across North America. The alliances that have been simmering since the peace of 1865 now snap into place. The United States, alienated by Britain and France, finds its interest aligning with the German Empire. The reasons are practical: a shared industrial outlook, a common resentment of British dominance, and a deep well of German heritage in American cities. When Europe erupts, the U.S. stands with the Central Powers. On the other side, the Confederacy answers the call of its old patrons. Its economy has been rebuilt with British and French capital. European advisors train its officers, and its cotton feeds the looms of Manchester's line. When Britain and France go to war with Germany, the CSA joins the Entente, eager to prove itself as a legitimate player on the world stage. And suddenly, decades of tension between North and South are no longer just a domestic affair, they're a live front in a global struggle. If the CSA and the USA enter the Great War on opposite sides, their long-frozen conflict could erupt again, diverting American troops from Europe to defend their own borders. The Mason-Dixon line, once a symbol of uneasy peace, becomes a continental front line. The old rivalries about tariffs, territory, and the meaning of freedom are reignited, but now the stakes are even higher. This time the world is watching, and every move is amplified by the interest of distant empires. The logic of alliances makes the situation volatile. Britain and France, eager to secure their North American ally, send weapons, supplies, and military advisors to Richmond. The Confederacy, emboldened by European backing, mobilizes its conscripted armies along the border. The United States, forced to split its attention, must now defend its own territory while supporting its allies across the Atlantic. The industrial might of the North is no longer a decisive advantage. It's stretched thin by the demand of two-front war. In this scenario, the infamous Zimmermann telegram takes on a new, more plausible shape. Instead of a desperate German plea to Mexico, Berlin reaches out to Richmond. The promise is concrete. Join the Central Powers, and the Confederacy will secure long-coveted Western territories. New Mexico, Arizona, perhaps even parts of California, should victory come. For the CSA, this isn't a distraction, it's an invitation to finish what was started in the 1860s, to expand westward under the legitimizing banner of global conflict. Well, the irony is sharp. The war that tears Europe apart now gives the old American rivalry a new and terrible energy. What historians might call, well, a Western Front opens not a war with Mexico, but a continental replay of sectional hostilities. Armies dig trenches not just in Flanders, but in the fields of Kentucky, the forests of Missouri, the outskirts of Baltimore. Cities that once symbolized the promise of a reunited nation now brace for siege or occupation. The language of propaganda shifts. No longer is a call to defend democracy in distant France. Now it's about survival at home, about brother against brother, about the unfinished business of a divided continent. The scale of the conflict is staggering. The United States, with its factories and forges, can produce endless rifles, shells, and locomotives, but the Confederacy, hardened by decades of militarization and propped up by European industry, is no longer outmatched. Its armies are disciplined, its officers seasoned, its population unified by a narrative of resistance and honor. The fields of Virginia and Tennessee become killing grounds once more, but this time with modern artillery, machine guns, and the lessons of European warfare. The impact on the global balance is immediate. In our timeline, American entry into World War I tipped the scales, flooding the Western Front with fresh troops and material. Here, that force is locked in a brutal struggle at home. The Entente, deprived of American reinforcements, faces a much harder fight in Europe. The Central Powers, relieved of pressure, find new opportunities to press their advantage. The war drags on, bloodier and more uncertain, as the world's most industrialized continent tears itself apart from within. The economic consequences ripple outward. The United States, instead of booming through war production for Europe, is forced into austerity and rationing. The Confederacy flushes with foreign loans, becomes a conduit of European goods and influence, but pays for it with blood and sovereignty. The dream of manifest destiny is finally buried beneath the mud and wire of a war no one can win outright. In the towns and cities of North America, the war is personal. Families are split by allegiance, old wounds are reopened, and every casualty list is a reminder of how far the country has fallen from the promise of peace. The propaganda machines on both sides churn out posters and pamphlets, but the message is always the same. The real enemy is the neighbor across the border, not the distant powers who pull the strings. Picture a single image. Two posters side by side in a train station. One, a Union soldier stares out from beneath his helmet. The words "Defend the Republic," "Enlist today," printed in bold. On the other, a Confederate in gray holds a rifle, his gaze just as determined. Honor the South. Join the fight. The faces are young, the uniforms different, but the language is heartbreakingly familiar. The grandsons of Gettysburg now march to the orders of foreign capitals, fighting not for unity, but for the agendas of powers an ocean away. When the guns finally fall silent, the world that emerges is changed in ways no treaty can fix. The United States and the Confederacy are spent. Their populations scarred, their economies shattered. Europe, too, is exhausted, but the old order has shifted. The idea of a simple two-sided world, democracy versus monarchy, freedom versus tyranny, no longer fits. The presence of a divided America, each half shaped by foreign alliances and bitter memory, ensures that the next chapter will be even more unpredictable. As the new lines are drawn, new rivalries take shape, and new ideologies rise, the world prepares for a future where power is never just a matter of two choices. The old contest between North and South has become something stranger, a permanent, unstable triangle where every move is shadowed by the mistakes and compromise of the past. The world changes when a third ideology enters the room. The Cold War, as we remember it, was a contest between two visions, one draped in stars and stripes and the other of red and revolution. But imagine a third flag, stitched from the fabric of a lost cause, unfurled by every summit and crisis. The three-player game begins. Picture this. The newsreels in Berlin in 1961, the wall rises, concrete and barbed wire dividing a city, a continent, an era. In this alternate timeline, the camera pans not just to America and Soviet officials, but to a Confederate envoy, impeccably dressed, watching with a gaze that betrays both calculation and distance. Every negotiation, every moment of brinkmanship is now shadowed by a third perspective. The United States defending liberal democracy, the Soviet Union advancing the cause of global communism, and the Confederate States of America built on a rigid racial hierarchy and aristocrat vision that neither side can fully stomach or ignore. The alliances never settle. The CSA's foreign policy is pragmatic, sometimes cynical. One year it leans toward Moscow, sharing intelligence, quietly undermining American influence in Africa or Southeast Asia. The next, it finds common cause with Washington, united by a mutual fear of communist expansion. The logic is always shifting. Economic interests, agricultural exports, and the need for international legitimacy drive every decision. The old world's powers, Britain and France, hedge their bets, sometimes drawn by Southern cotton, sometimes repelled by the Confederacy's social order. The triangle is never equilateral. Every side is wary, every handshake is tentative, every promise provisional. The domino theory, once simple in its terror, becomes a tangle of competing fears. Proxy conflicts in the developing world become three-way struggles as each power vies for influence. A new government in the West, Africa, is courted by American aid, Soviet arms, and Confederate promises of order and tradition. In Latin America, leaders weigh their options, align with the North for investment, with the Soviets for revolution, or with the South for a different kind of stability. CSA's ideology, rooted in racial hierarchy, appeals to some authoritarian regimes, offering a model of control that sidesteps both democracy and Marxism. The result is chaos. No single ideology sweeps the board. Every proxy war is shifting contests, alliances changing with the seasons. The outcome is never certain. Speculation swirls around the Confederate nuclear question. The doctrine of mutuality assured destruction, so grimly effective between two superpowers, becomes far less stable when a third actor enters the equation. If the CSA had survived into the nuclear age, it might have sought a limited deterrent, creating a tripolar standoff, but a full nuclear arsenal seems unlikely given its smaller industrial base. Now, some alternate theorists imagine the South racing for its own bomb, a scenario that would render global deterrence far more fragile. Even the possibility of a Confederate warhead changes the calculations in every capital. Every crisis, Cuba, Berlin, the Middle East, now has a third set of red lines, a third leader with their own vision of what it's worth risking everything to protect. The world's nerves are stretched thinner, the potential for miscalculation higher than ever. Inside the United States, the presence of a Confederacy is a constant living provocation. The civil rights movement unfolds with a hostile neighbor just across the border, a state whose very existence is rebuke to the idea of American progress. Every march, every sit-in, every speech in Washington is amplified by the contrast. The CSA offers quiet support to segregationists, funds sympathetic politicians, and broadcasts propaganda designed to undermine the legitimacy of the civil rights struggle. The Soviets seized the opportunity, pointing to both the CSA and American racial injustice as proof that the West's promises are hollow. At the United Nations, the debate is relentless. How can America claim to lead the free world when apartheid flourishes next door and the color line still divides its own cities? The struggle for influence doesn't stop at borders. American and Confederate spies have moved through the same European capitals, the same African ports, the same bustling streets of Asia and South America. Soviet agents exploit the tension, playing North against South, sometimes supporting liberation movements, sometimes backing regimes that promise to keep the communists out. The world's map of alliances is redrawn every few years. Every coup and revolution, a potential shift and then rebalance. The three-player game is never fair and never still. The economic battle is just as fierce. The USA touts free markets, innovation, and the promise of upward mobility. The CSA counters with agricultural trade, low tariffs, and the lure of order for elites. Threatened by social upheaval, the Soviet Union offers a third path: central planning, state investment, ideological solidarity. Developing nations become the arena for this competition. Their leaders courted, pressured, sometimes overthrown. Trade wars flare, embargoes are imposed, and black markets thrive in the spaces where officials' policies can't keep up. Culture becomes a battleground. The United States projects its music, movies, and technology across the globe, but its image is tarnished by the reality of its divided continent. The CSA promotes its own vision, rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and exclusion, offering an alternate to both Western modernity and communist revolution. The Soviets amplify every American failure, every Confederate atrocity, weaving them into a narrative of Western hypocrisy. The world's artists, writers, and intellects are pulled in every direction, their work shaped by the constant tension, the need to choose sides or carve out a dangerous middle ground. The presence of a third power destabilizes everything. The old logic of the Cold War, two superpowers locked in a balance of terror, no longer applies. Every diplomatic crisis is a three-way standoff, every arms negotiation a contest of shifting priorities and hidden agendas. The possibility of accidental war, of a single misstep triggering a cascade of catastrophe, grows with every year. The world is more connected, but also more brittle. The sense of living on the edge of history, waiting for one wrong move, never fades. And yet, for all its instability, this world is marked by a strange, relentless tension. No side can win outright. Every victory is partial, every defeat temporary. The three-player game ensures that the struggle never ends. Only changes shape, moves to a new front, finds a new battleground. The Cold War, once a grim duo, has become a disordinate trio, each note sharper and more uncertain than the last. Somewhere in the photo from a tense summit, three leaders sit around a table. Their faces are set, their eyes wary. There is no handshake, no real trust, just the knowledge that the world they inhabit is a result of choices made long ago, and that the cost of those choices is paid every day. We don't live in that world, but its shadow lingers close enough to touch. Shift the lens to the present. Echoes of the lost, peace never signed, but always possible, still hum beneath the surface of our world. Imagine the subtle daily reminders of a history that forked in 1865 and never found its way back. The alternate timeline is not a world of grand gestures, but of small, persistent differences, each one a quiet signal that the past never truly lets go. Picture a morning in a city that feels familiar but isn't. The skyline is dotted with both Union and Confederate flags, one on a government building, the other on a bank's glass tower. A commuter checks her phone. The headlines split across rival networks: USN, the United States News, and CBC, the Confederate Broadcasting Corporation. Each tells the news with its own slant, its own priorities. A new electric car slides past, but the badge reads Richmond Motors, not Tesla. The world is connected, but the cracks show everywhere. A flight from New York to Atlanta demands a passport and a customs scan. The internet is a patchwork of firewall networks and national domains. Even the weather app has to ask which country you're in before it loads the forecast. The differences don't shout, they whisper. A family road trip means border checks at the Potomac, a new set of rules and roadside billboards as you cross into the South. The food changes, the radio stations fade, the money in your wallet is suddenly the wrong color. The background noise of life is a constant reminder. Unity was an option, not a guarantee. But the deepest fracture runs through the question of freedom. Would slavery have survived into the 21st century? Not in its old form. By the dawn of the Industrial Age, the economies of chattel slavery would have collapsed under the weight of machines and global markets. But the Confederacy's foundation was never just economics, it was ideology. The end of formal slavery would not mean the arrival of true equality. Instead, the system would mutate, adapting to new technologies and new fears. Imagine a society where the law codifies hierarchy, where surveillance enforces separation, where every advance in technology is repurposed to maintain the old world order. The world would not see abolition, but a new, more insidious kind of apartheid, one with sharper teeth, longer reach, and the cold efficiency of a century's worth of practice. International pressure would mount, but the South would dig in. And embargoes would come and go. The Confederacy would respond by doubling down on self-sufficiency and by seeking out allies who value trade over principle. Foreign corporations might invest, but always with an eye on the fine print: labor laws, movement restrictions, and the ever-present threat of diplomatic incident. The United States, meanwhile, would find itself in a moral bind, forced to confront the daily reality of a neighboring regime built on exclusion, but unable to force change without risking war. Its leaders would speak in the soaring language of freedom, but the world would hear the hollow echo: condemnation without consequence. The American identity itself would be smaller, more defensive. Without the momentum of a victorious, unified nation, the United States would be cautious, perhaps even isolationist. It would police its borders, guard its industries, and measure every foreign policy move against the risk of Southern retaliation. The research points to a country much less able to impose its moral vision on others. The rhetoric might be lofty, but the reach would be short. The world's great causes, democracy, human rights, open markets, would have one less champion, and perhaps a weaker one at that. The knock-on effects would ripple far beyond politics. The economic miracle of post-war America, the engine that powered the 20th century, would sputter without a vast, unified market. The confidence that comes from victory innovation would slow. The tech boom might have a look very different, shaped by the needs of border security and international control, rather than by the dream of a connected globe. Silicon Valley, if it existed at all, would be one of many regional hubs, each hemmed in by national priorities and wary of foreign eyes. The internet, instead of a borderless frontier, would fracture into competing networks, each shaped by the anxieties of its own government. Culture, too, would split along the old fault lines. The shared musical heritage that crossed regional lines could have fractured, leading to distinct northern and southern styles rather than a unified American sound. The blues, jazz, and rock and roll art forms, all born from the collision of pain and hope, migration and reinvention, might never have become the world's soundtrack. Instead, the North and South would cultivate separate traditions, each shaped by its own struggles, its own silences. The Great Migration, which carried the music of the South to the cities of the North, might never have happened. The result, a world where the American voice is divided, its influence diluted, its story told in competing dialects. The global consequences would be profound. The idea of America as a symbol, however flawed, a possibility and renewal, would fracture. The United States would still exist, but as a diminished power, forever negotiating with its hostile neighbor, forever explaining its compromises to the world. Its condemnations of tyranny would ring hollow while an authoritarian regime thrived just across the border. The Confederacy, for its part, would become a cautionary tale that never ends, a reminder that history's darkest chapters don't always close, they just change shape. The economic balance of the world would shift. Without the stabilizing force of a booming unified United States, the global system would wobble. The British and French empires might have lasted longer, their influence propped up by a divided continent. The Great Depression of the 1880s could have spiraled into a final crisis as the absence of American growth left Europe's capitalist order exposed. World wars might have come sooner, their causes more tangled, their outcomes even less certain. The great game of European powers would find a new arena in North America, with both the Union and the Confederacy pulled into alliances and rivalries not of their own making. And yet, the most unsettling echo is not in the headlines or the history books. It's in the small daily choices, the things we take for granted. The ease of travel, the sound of a song on the radio, the flag on a child's backpack. In this alternate present, everything is a negotiation. Nothing is assumed. Every step forward is shadowed by the knowledge that the ground beneath you could shift at any moment. We look at the flag, 50 stars, 13 stripes, waving in the afternoon sun. It's ordinary, almost invisible, until you imagine what could have been. The wholeness of it is not just a symbol, but a choice made and remade across generations. What single choice unites us with that flag today? That's the story we inherited. Sometimes the cost of peace is far higher than the cost of war. The quietest what-ifs in history are often the ones that echo the loudest, reminding us that the world we have is not guaranteed. It was fought for, and it must be remembered. History is a mirror, sometimes clear, sometimes fogged with the breath of what almost happened. The story of a peace that split America in two isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a reminder that every turning point leaves behind a world of shadows, alternate visions of ourselves. Churchill once said, "History is written by the victors," reflecting on how the stories we accept are shaped by those who survive to tell them. This alternate timeline forces us to question which truths endure and which are lost to silence. And if you want more alternate histories that challenge what we take for granted, subscribe and let us know which turning point fascinates you the most. Your theories might be the next story we explore.